Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related matter to take you away from whatever is happening in your everyday life. What I do here is I attempt to answer questions posed by viewers, readers, and listeners, and I will attempt to answer it in 10 minutes. As you can tell by the length of some videos, most of the time I don't quite manage that. I go over, sometimes under, and sometimes on time, but we'll see. You can ask us a question however you like. You can send us an email. You can send us a comment on a previous video or podcast. You can send me a postcard. I just renewed my PO Box rent for the week, for the year. So you can send me questions right into April 2026 now. PO Box 222, Belfield, Belfield, NSW 2191 Australia. That will get to me. Love it. Love a nice postcard. And I will attempt to answer your question. Now, today's question is from Jan Willem, who's asked a question before. Dear Murray, I have a question on the Scythed Chariots at Gaugamela, the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC between Alexander the Great and Darius III of Persia. I developed and played a wargame scenario on it, and these things have become a true enigma. The problem is the number of chariots, the frontage they could cover in relation to the phalanx, and how agile the phalanx would need to be in order to let them through harmlessly. The letting them through aspect of the story is where I get stuck. As I read the story of the battle, the Persians used some 200 scythed chariots. They charged, the phalanx opened up, they passed, and were dealt with by the Macedonian rear. With 4 horses each, plus the protruding scythes and a safety margin, I would propose that each of these would cover just under 10 metres of frontage, but let's use 10 for easy calculations. 200 chariots at 10 metres each is 2 kilometres of frontage for all in a single rank. 24,000 phalangites cover just over 1 kilometre when deployed in 16 ranks. It could be that the chariots were deployed in multiple ranks, but that only worsens the agility challenge for the phalanx. The question is, at what moment does the phalanx open up? For a 10-metre wide chariot, it would need to shift some 12 files to the rear. That takes time, and when done too early, the chariot might adjust its course, assuming the driver doesn't jump off too early, if at all. When too late, you're too late. And when the chariots would come in multiple ranks or waves, perhaps, this dances of the phalangite files would need to proceed with something close to the rhythm of the quickstep. I just don't see that having happened. Also, because it is easy to cover the entire phalanx with 200 chariots in multiple lines, there seems nowhere to hide for the phalanx against such a number of chariots. So, what did really happen? Were there indeed 200 chariots? Were there many less, or have the numbers been reinterpreted when the story was written? Were there any scythed chariots at all to begin with, or are they just a figment of the imagination of a later author who wanted to add an extra drama to further emphasize Alexander's glory and greatness? Best regards, Jan Willem. Okay, look at that nitty-gritty question. Fantastic stuff. Okay, so there are indeed 200 scythed chariots in the Persian deployment as described by several sources. They are in 3 units, 2 of 50 and 1 of 100. We don't know whether they are deployed in 1 rank deep or multiple ranks deep, but we do know from the accounts of the battle, especially in Diodorus, that but we've got 4 main accounts for the battle, which Diodorus, Arrian, of course, Quintus Curtius Rufus, and Plutarch, and lots of other bits and pieces in the history of Alexander that give us details. Now, the first thing to note is that there are 3 defenses against the scythed chariots rather than just the one. One is that the phalanx is ordered to lock shields. Gosh, pronunciation of ancient Greek. Synaspazuzes, which is the formation where the Macedonian phalanx close together, and it's the tightest formation. We assume that it's a roughly 50 centimeters of frontage per man, which means, of course, that your entire phalanx of 9,000 men, not 24,000 men, is only 250 meters wide, which is not much at all. And that's firstly a defense. So that's the good old-fashioned idea that forces will not charge what they perceive to be a solid wall, and therefore a close order phalanx will present the idea of a solid wall to the Persians. Not to mention, of course, you've got meters of sarissa points in front of that wall, which will deal with some chariots, or certainly chariot horses. The second is the men are instructed to beat their shields to create a din to put the chariot horses off. So there's those. We do not hear of the effect of these other than that the side chariots are defeated. So we don't hear individually that this one worked better than this one worked better than the other. Now, the third defense is the one that you talk about, that the chariots were shied away, turned towards their own ranks by the other two techniques. Others were channeled through gaps opened up in each taxis by the men of the phalanx. Now, you have assumed that they go to the back. The counter-marching, and again, and this is in the Tactica manuals, is several of the options are left or right. And so, in fact, you can counter-march a syntagma of the phalanx, that's 256 men. So each taxis of the phalanx in the ancient Macedonian Alexander the Great phalanx, there's 6 taxae. Each individual taxis has 6 syntagmata, individual syntagma. So it's 6 times 256 times 6. That's the full manpower of the phalanx. And what I think happens is it's either a Laconian or a Macedonian countermarch, which is sideways, left or right. And so I'm assuming that the gap is one syntagma countermarches into the syntagma next to them. And so what you have then is 3 gaps appearing in each taxis. And so with 6 taxae, you have 18 gaps, which the chariots are channeled down. Now, firstly, that's in combination with these other 2 defenses, which seem to be effective. So imagine then that the front rank of the phalanx is locked shields. Imagine then that every second syntagma of each taxis countermarches to a gap next to it. And so you've got a bristling locked wall frontage making a clattering noise, and then there's gaps that the chariots run down. And I think that it's each of the 3 defenses that are effective. And so, again, it's a tricky one in terms of your idea about frontage, because if you've got this locked shield formation for the entire phalanx, it's very, very small. So a syntagma of 16 men wide, 16 men deep, 50 centimeters per man is only 8 meters. So again, you've got an entire phalanx is what I said 250. It's 288 meters across. So, but your estimation of a single chariot being 10 or round about 10 seems to work. So if you've got a syntagma, it's 8 meters across. What we can assume, therefore, is that a single-sized chariot fits into that 8-meter gap without chopping the legs off of the men on either side. So say 6 meters wide for a chariot, in which case you've got chariots going down these gaps being funneled by the spears and the noise. So some of the chariots are obviously going to be impaled upon the sarissa points. Some of the chariots are going to be turned back by the noise and the fact that the chariot in front of them is stopped and shy and all of that sort of thing. And then others are going to be channeled down these 8-meter wide avenues through the phalanx. And again, it's another fascinating aspect of the Macedonian phalanx. If these men are locked shields, now they can't be locked shields in terms of only 50 centimeters of space behind if they're going to countermarch into the gap. But if we think about that, if it is that compact, you're really dealing with a phalanx that's 16 meters deep. It's not particularly deep before the chariots are through that formation and being dealt with by the men in the rear of the deployment of Alexander. So I think it's the 3 things. I don't know in a gaming scenario how you would roll dice to represent the solid wall horses refusing to charge, or indeed the shying away because of noise. I don't know how you would roll that, noise roll. I'm sure there are some Chaos Space Marines players who could argue that. Plague Marines? Well, I'm not sure. Sorry, my 40k lore is not good. But I think those things are interesting. Now, of course, the fascinating thing about the chariots, because again, we get chariots at the Battle of, come on, brain, Cunaxa, and we even have an account of them ploughing into, I think it's a Greek peltast who gets thrown into the air, but then gets up without a wound, and the fact that the Greek forces suffer not a single wound at the Battle of Cunaxa. Now, in that case, I think the Scythed Chariot, and it makes comebacks at various points in time. I think in the previous podcast I mentioned it's suggested by the Doribus Bellicus in the late 4th century AD as a addition. Why don't you try this terror weapon? And I think the interesting thing is that it is a terror weapon. It's a psychological weapon. It's very rare that a chariot, Scythed Chariot force especially, is effective on the battlefield. They're much more effective as a daunting prospect to face. And one of the things that Alexander's battle at Gaugamela shows is when you come up with a foolproof plan, and 3 of them, they actually are very effective against these Scythed Chariots, and so they become redundant and ineffective. And so they're effective when you don't have that kind of command and trust in your commanders. Oh my gosh, try the chariots, what are we going to do? Flee! No, this is what we do. Bum, 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 bum. And in fact, is it Plutarch, I think, that talks about Alexander staying up late all night thinking about how am I going to go overcome this problem. And so that also is something that there's a lot of thought been put into the overcoming of this issue. And so I think those are the things. I think if you were going to use Scythed Chariots effectively, they actually need to be wicking at the corners of not the phalanx, the support troops. If you rob the phalanx of its flank support, the phalanx is vulnerable. If you charge Scythed Chariots not into the center heavy infantry formation that can indeed adopt a locked shield formation, but instead you charge it into the light armed troops who are not able to have a locked shield formation and are only really using missiles, javelins and arrows and slings, they're more vulnerable to Scythed Chariot attack. So I think in a way there's a lack of imagination or complex thinking by the Persians. They put them in the front, in the flat, specially prepared area of the battlefield. In fact, maybe, this is me thinking on the fly here, Jan Willem, perhaps the whole idea of the specially prepared flattened battlefield for the Scythed Chariots, we normally look at that as the Macedonians putting their main infantry at risk by choosing that part of the battlefield for the phalanx to deploy. It could be the other way around. No, I'm choosing to put my troops who can go into a locked shield formation, which will defeat the Scythed Chariots in the part of the field that is prepared for them. Not, I will put my vulnerable light armed troops who can't effectively face Scythed Chariots in the part of the battlefield prepared for Scythed Chariots. So rather than you're risking, look at it as actually your troops that you put in front of the Scythed Chariots have the best possible prospect of defeating them. So it's a tactical deployment genius rather than why are you doing that? Why are you putting them at risk? So I think there's an interesting thing there that Alexander knows, because he's devised not a foolproof, but certainly, as it turns out, a foolproof plan for his troops against the Scythed Chariots. So that, I think, answers it. Well, I hope it answers it. Now, that's my thinking on it, that it's a combination of those 3 defenses that works, and it's deliberate rather than accidental, and that the power of the Scythed Chariot, even in some cases the elephant, is psychological rather than on the battlefield tactical advantage. And I think that if I was Darius, or if you were playing Darius in a battle against the Macedonian phalanx, don't put your Scythed Chariots against the phalanx. Put your Scythed Chariots against the weaker troops, and that way they're actually going to have an effect, and even a better psychological effect, because your Alexander general knows that those lighter troops are vulnerable to Scythed Chariots, whereas he's devised a way for his heavy infantry not to be. There you go. That was that Ancient Warfare answer. Join me again for another Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, and I will see you then. Thanks. Bye.